When the quiet man stepped into the world beyond the prison walls, it felt unreal at first. The wind touched his face differently. The air carried scents he had almost forgotten. The smell of rain on dust, the faint sweetness of grass, and the distant hum of cars on the road. After years of hearing only metal doors, footsteps, and commands, the sounds of ordinary life felt strange, almost too gentle. He stood there for a while, not moving, just breathing. Then slowly he started walking. He didn't have much with him, only the notebook, the old letter, and the new one that had arrived the day before. In a small envelope tucked inside his pocket was a bus ticket the warden had arranged for him. The destination was a town several hours away, where an organization helped people rebuild their lives after prison. The bus ride was quiet. He sat near the window, watching the fields and small houses pass by. Every now and then he saw people going about their day. Families at bus stops, children on bicycles, an old man watering his garden. He couldn't help but smile softly. It was like watching pieces of a life he had once known. When the bus reached the town, he stepped off and stood for a moment, unsure of where to go. He walked down a small street lined with old buildings and stopped outside a community center with a sign that read, "Second Step." He took a breath and went inside. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" He nodded politely. "The warden said someone here might be expecting me." She checked a list and said, "Yes, of course. You must be the teacher." The word made him pause for a moment. It had been a long time since anyone called him that. He nodded again. "Yes, that used to be me." She led him to a small room at the back. Inside were tables, a few chairs, and a box of books stacked neatly on a shelf. "This is where you'll be helping," she said. "We run a small reading and writing program for people who are trying to start over. Some of them can't read well, some just need a place to talk." He smiled faintly. "That sounds familiar." The first few weeks were quiet. He spent his days sorting through old donated books, cleaning and preparing lessons. Sometimes people came in, shy at first, just to sit and listen. He never forced conversation. He just welcomed them, the same way he had done in the prison library. One afternoon, a young man came in and said he'd heard there was someone who could help him write a letter. The quiet man nodded. "Sit," he said gently. "Tell me what you want to say." It didn't take long before word spread. More people started showing up. Men and women who were trying to rebuild their lives, people who had made mistakes but still wanted to find hope again. Some brought stories they wanted to tell. Others just came to listen. He never asked anyone about their past. He only asked what they wanted their future to sound like. As time passed, he started receiving letters from the prison. The young inmate who had taken over the writing sessions sent updates every few weeks. "We still meet in the library," one letter said. "I try to teach them like you taught me. It's not the same without you, but I think you'd be proud." The man would smile as he read those words. "I already am," he whispered to himself. One day the community center invited him to speak at a local event. At first he refused. "I'm not much for speeches," he said. But the director insisted, saying his story could inspire others. After some thought, he agreed. The day of the event, the small hall filled with people. Some were students, some were families, some were people who had come out of prison just like him. He stood quietly at the front for a moment, looking at them. He began slowly. "For a long time I thought silence meant peace," he said. "I thought if I said nothing, the world would stop hurting. But I learned that silence can also be a wall, one that keeps you from hearing the people who need you most." He spoke about the prison, not as a place of punishment, but as a place where he learned what listening really meant. He told them how a small act, writing a letter, reading a story, sitting beside someone, could change a life. He didn't talk about what he had done to end up there. That part didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what he had learned inside those walls. When he finished, the room was quiet, just like the day he first read his letter in the prison library. Then slowly people began to clap. Some stood, others simply wiped their eyes. After the event, several people came up to thank him. One of them was a woman holding a notebook. "My brother is in prison," she said softly. "I didn't know how to reach him. But hearing you speak, maybe I'll start with a letter." He smiled gently. "Letters can find their way even when people can't," he said. Months passed. He became part of the town quietly, the way he always had. never drawing too much attention, never asking for more than he needed. But the people around him began to notice how things changed when he was near. The center grew busier. People who hadn't read in years started picking up books again. Those who were lost began to find words for their feelings. Then one morning he received another letter from the prison. This one wasn't from the young inmate. It was from the warden. It said, "I thought you'd like to know. We renamed the library. It's now called the Quiet Room. The men say it helps them remember what you taught them, that silence can build, not break." He read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it inside his notebook beside the first two letters. For a long time he sat there in the quiet room of the community center, smiling softly. Years went by. His hair turned gray, his hands grew slower, but his eyes still carried that calm light. He never became famous. He didn't want to be. But people in the town, and even some far beyond it, came to know him as the man who listened. Sometimes new volunteers came to help at the center. They'd ask him what he used to do before all this. He would just smile and say, "I was a student of silence." But one day a local newspaper wrote a small article about him. They wanted to share how a former inmate had turned his time behind bars into something meaningful. The story spread slowly, quietly, until one day, a familiar face appeared at the community center, a young man, a little older now, wearing simple clothes and a hopeful smile. The quiet man looked up from his desk and recognized him immediately. "You made it," he said softly. The young man nodded. "I got out last month. I thought I'd find you." He smiled warmly. "You found me." The young man handed him a small notebook. "We kept the writing sessions going. I thought maybe you'd want to read what everyone wrote." The older man took the notebook and opened it carefully. Inside were pages filled with words, letters, thoughts, stories. The handwriting was different, but the feeling was the same. It was as if all the voices he had once listened to had followed him here. He closed the notebook and looked up. "You kept your promise." "So did you," the young man said quietly. They sat together for a long while, not talking much, just sharing the silence that now felt peaceful instead of heavy. Later that evening, as the sun set outside the window, the quiet man walked to the shelf where his old notebook sat. He opened it and placed the young man's notebook beside it. Then he looked around the small room, at the books, the letters, the faces that had come through those doors, and smiled. In a way, he realized, the prison had never really been about walls or gates. It had been about the lessons he carried out of it, the ones he had given and the ones he had received. He turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped outside. The night air was cool and calm. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "I kept my promise." And somewhere in the quiet spaces of the world, it felt like someone, or something, answered back. Not in words, just in silence. The kind of silence that feels like peace. The day of the hearing felt like a strange kind of silence hung over the prison. Even the usual sounds, the distant clang of metal doors, the shuffle of feet, the dull echo of voices seemed quieter than usual. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. The quiet man sat in a small waiting room near the warden's office, wearing the same simple prison uniform he'd worn for years. In his hands he held that old worn letter. The paper had faded at the edges, but he still treated it like something precious. When the warden stepped into the room, he gave him a slow nod. "They're ready for you," he said. The man stood up calmly. His walk was steady, his eyes thoughtful. He had spent years preparing for this moment, not by planning what to say, but by learning to understand silence. Inside the room, 3 people sat behind a table, 2 members of the parole board and a counselor. The warden stood near the back, observing quietly. They asked him the usual questions, about his past, his time in prison, what he had learned, what he planned to do if released. His answers were honest, simple, and without excuses. He didn't try to sound perfect. He just spoke the truth. When one of the board members asked, "Why should we believe you've changed?" he didn't hesitate. "I don't expect you to believe it," he said softly. "I just hope you can see it." There was something in his tone, steady, sincere, that made everyone in the room look up from their papers. Then, the counselor asked, "What would you say to the people you hurt? If they were here today?" The man paused for a long moment. You could hear the faint hum of the air vent, the ticking of the clock. Then he spoke. "I would tell them I'm sorry," he said, "but not because I want forgiveness. I would tell them because they deserve to hear it. I've learned that regret isn't about what you lose, it's about what you took from others when you weren't listening." For a long time, no one spoke. The warden, standing in the back, watched the board members exchange quiet looks. When it was over, they thanked him and told him they would make their decision soon. He nodded politely and left the room with the warden. As they walked back through the hall, the warden said quietly, "You handled that well." The man smiled faintly. "I didn't handle it. I just told the truth." The warden stopped for a moment, watching him. "You know, when you first came here, nobody knew what to make of you. But you've done more for this place than most people ever could." The man lowered his eyes slightly. "We all need a reason to keep going," he said. "Sometimes helping others gives us that reason." When they reached the cell block, the other inmates were waiting quietly, pretending not to watch but clearly curious. The young inmate who had become close to him met his eyes and mouthed, "How'd it go?" The man gave a small shrug and said softly, "We'll see." The next few days passed slowly. Everyone wanted to ask him what the board had decided, but nobody dared. He went about his work as usual, cleaning, reading, and helping in the writing sessions. But even as he smiled and listened, something in his eyes seemed far away, as if he was already half in another world. One evening, as he sat in the library reading alone, the older guard came in with a folded paper in his hand. His expression was unreadable. He stood by the door for a moment, then said, "They've made their decision." The man looked up slowly. The guard walked closer, handed him the paper and said, "Congratulations." For the first time in years, the quiet man closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't a loud reaction, no tears or shouts, just a soft, calm relief. "When?" he asked quietly. "Next week," the guard said. "You'll be released next week." The man nodded. "Thank you," the guard smiled. "No, thank you. You've done something here none of us could." That night, word spread faster than anyone expected. The quiet man was getting out. The news moved through the halls, through whispers and small conversations. Most people were happy for him. A few were jealous. But everyone agreed. If anyone deserved a second chance, it was him. Over the next few days, the young inmate stayed close to him. "It's going to be strange without you here," he said. The man smiled softly. "It'll be all right. You'll keep going. You've got things to say now, don't you?" The young man nodded. "Yeah, but I learned that from you." "No," the man said gently. "You just remembered it. It was always in you." They sat in silence for a while, just listening to the sound of the yard gate closing in the distance. On his last night in the cell, the man didn't sleep much. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding the letter he had carried since the day he arrived. The words were worn, but he didn't need to read them anymore. He knew them by heart. It was from someone he had once loved deeply, someone he had hurt without meaning to. The letter ended with a line that had stayed with him all these years. "Maybe one day you'll find peace in the quiet." He smiled faintly and folded it again, placing it inside his notebook. Then he whispered to himself, "I think I finally understand." The next morning, the sun came through the narrow window just right, painting a warm line across the floor. The guard came to open the cell. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," the man replied. He walked through the same halls where he had once arrived in chains. This time he carried nothing but his notebook and that folded letter. The men in the block stood by their cells, watching him go. Some nodded. Some called out good luck. Even those who barely knew him wanted to say something. The young inmate stepped forward and said, "You're not just leaving, you know. You're taking part of this place with you." The man stopped and placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said softly. "You all are what I'm leaving behind." When he reached the main gate, the warden was waiting. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. "Before you go," the warden said, "there's something you should know." He handed him a sealed envelope. "This came for you yesterday. No return address." The quiet man opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper with a few handwritten lines. As he read it, his expression softened, and his eyes glistened slightly. The warden watched but didn't ask what it said. After a moment, the man folded the paper and said quietly, "It's from the person who wrote me that first letter." They said they heard about what I've been doing here. The warden nodded. That must feel good. It feels like the world is finally quiet again, he said. The warden extended his hand. Good luck out there. The man shook it firmly. Thank you. For everything. Then, as the gates opened, he stepped outside into the light. The air felt different. Fresh, open, full of sound and silence all at once. For the first time in years, he could walk without walls around him. He looked up at the sky and closed his eyes. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. He just walked slowly down the road, each step feeling lighter than the last. But back inside the prison, his absence was immediately felt. The library felt emptier. The yard was quieter, but not the same kind of quiet as before. The men he had taught still gathered, still wrote, still talked, but now they did it together. The young inmate took over the sessions, using the same notebook the man had left for him. He read aloud one of the lines the quiet man had written on the first page. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness. It's the space where change begins, and with that everyone in the room knew. They hadn't just lost another inmate. They had found a teacher. But outside those walls, the quiet man was beginning a new chapter. And the world was about to find out that the prison's quietest inmate had once been someone much more than anyone ever imagined. And soon, everyone would know his name. Not because of what he had done wrong, but because of what he had become. After that day in the warden's office, something felt different around the quiet man. He didn't say much about what had happened, but everyone could sense a shift in the air. Even the guards who usually spoke with authority now seemed to treat him with a kind of quiet respect. The younger inmates kept whispering about it. Some said the warden had found out something about his past. Others thought he was being considered for early release. A few even joked that maybe he was working for the prison. But those who knew him better could tell. None of that was true. Whatever the warden told him had to be something deeper. The next morning, the quiet man went about his routine as usual. He woke early, folded his blanket, washed his face, and stood near the window for a while, letting the first bit of sunlight touch his face. When the others started to wake up, they found him already dressed and ready for work. In the kitchen, the older guard approached him again. You all right? He asked casually. The man gave a soft nod. Just thinking. About what? About how strange it is, he said, wiping down a counter. You can be surrounded by noise every day, and still the loudest thing in your life is the voice inside your head. The guard looked at him carefully. Did the warden tell you something? He told me something I already knew, the man said with a small smile. Then he looked up. He just made me remember it again. The guard didn't ask more. He'd learned that the quiet man had a way of saying things that sounded simple, but always carried something hidden beneath. Later that week, the warden called for a meeting in the common hall. Everyone was told to attend. It was rare for the warden to address the whole prison directly, so people started guessing what it might be about. When they all gathered, the warden stood at the front, his voice echoing against the walls. He spoke about change, about second chances, about programs that could help inmates rebuild their lives after release. Then he said something unexpected. Starting next month, he announced, we'll have a new reading and writing program, led by one of your own. A murmur spread through the crowd. The warden continued. Some of you already know him. He's been helping many of you without even being asked. He's shown that quiet strength can sometimes speak louder than words. Then the warden turned slightly and nodded toward the quiet man. Every head in the hall turned to look. For a few seconds, nobody said a thing. Then one by one, people started nodding, clapping softly. Even those who didn't know him well joined in. It wasn't the kind of applause that came from excitement. It was respect. The quiet man didn't smile widely or make a speech. He just bowed his head slightly, as if he understood what was being given to him wasn't just an opportunity, it was trust. After that day, his life inside the prison changed. He started holding small group sessions in the library, helping others write letters, stories, or even simple notes to their families. Some of the men had never written a letter in years. Some didn't even know how to start one. He sat with them patiently, guiding their words, helping them express things they hadn't said in a long time. At first, only a few showed up. Then week after week more came. Soon the small corner of the library was full every time. The guards watched quietly from the door. Even they seemed to appreciate the peace that filled the room when he was there. He didn't just teach writing, he listened. When someone couldn't find the right words, he asked gentle questions that led them to what they really wanted to say. Sometimes men who had never shown emotion before ended up sitting with their heads down, holding a piece of paper, and realizing they had more inside them than they thought. One day, the younger inmate who had befriended him came running into the library with a letter in his hand. "She wrote back," he said, waving it proudly. The quiet man looked up from the table and smiled. "That's good." "She said she forgives me," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly. "I never thought I'd hear that." "Words can open doors," the quiet man said softly. "Even the ones we thought were locked for good." Moments like that began to change the way everyone saw him. He wasn't just another inmate anymore. He was someone who helped others remember who they were before the walls closed in. But one evening after a session, a guard came to his cell and said the warden wanted to see him again. This time, when he entered the office, the warden was sitting at his desk with a file open in front of him. "You've made quite an impression," the warden said. "These programs were meant to help men express themselves. But you've done more than that. You've made them believe they're still worth something." The man stayed quiet, waiting. The warden continued, "I've read your file. I know what happened, and I know it wasn't as simple as it looks on paper. You've served most of your time now, and the board has been reviewing your case." There was a pause. The warden looked up. "You might be eligible for parole soon." The man didn't show surprise. He just took a slow breath. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. The warden leaned back. "You've built something good here. If you do get out, I hope you don't stop helping people." "I won't," the man said. "But even if I leave, I think something will stay behind." When he walked back to his cell that night, the others saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't relief or pride. It was something softer, almost peaceful. The young inmate came up to him later and asked, "Is it true? They might let you out?" The quiet man nodded. "Maybe." "So what will you do?" He looked toward the small window where the moonlight shone through the bars. "I'll go home," he said, then paused. "But first I'll have to remember where home really is." The next few weeks went by slowly. The writing sessions continued, but everyone knew things were changing. People treated him differently, not because he might leave soon, but because they realized what he had given them. He helped one man write a letter to his daughter for the first time in 15 years. He helped another finish a story he'd started when he was young, but never finished because life got in the way. He never asked for anything in return. Sometimes, after everyone left, he would stay behind in the empty library, sitting by himself. He would open his old notebook and read from it quietly. Inside were pages filled with memories, thoughts, and lessons he had written over the years. But one page stayed folded, an old letter that he never sent. One night, the older guard found him there. "Still writing?" he asked gently. "Always," the man said, closing the notebook. "You've done a lot here," the guard said. "More than you know." The man smiled. "Maybe, but it's not about me." The guard hesitated. "If you get out, will you ever come back?" The man looked around the empty room and said softly, "If I can, I will. Not as an inmate, but as a reminder that silence doesn't mean absence." The guard nodded. He didn't fully understand what that meant, but he knew it was important. As days turned into weeks, the parole decision grew closer. Everyone in the prison seemed to hold their breath. Even those who rarely cared about others found themselves hoping he would get another chance. On the morning of the hearing, the warden came to his cell personally. "It's time," he said. The man stood up, folded his blanket one last time, and looked around the small cell that had been his world for years. Then he picked up his old book and the letter he had carried from the day he arrived. He walked down the long hallway, past faces that had once looked at him with suspicion, but now watched him with quiet respect. Nobody said much. Nobody needed to. Because by then everyone knew that the quiet man had changed the prison, not with power or words shouted loud, but with calm, patience, and the kind of kindness that doesn't ask for anything in return. What they didn't know yet was that When the truth about who he really was came out, it would leave them all speechless, and that truth was about to be revealed. When he finished reading his letter that day, the room stayed quiet for a few seconds. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from boredom or confusion. It was the kind that comes when people hear something that hits deep inside them. The volunteers looked at each other surprised, and one of them even forgot to collect the papers afterward. The man had spoken softly, but every word carried weight. Like he wasn't reading from a page, he was reading from a piece of his life. He folded the paper neatly, placed it on the table, and said thank you to the volunteers. Then he walked out, calm as always. But everyone who had been in that room watched him go, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. One of the guards, the older one who had always been curious about him, later asked one of the volunteers what he had written. The volunteer said quietly, "It wasn't just a letter. It sounded like something a teacher or a writer would write, about regret and time, and how silence can become a kind of prison too." That night, the cell block felt different. A few inmates started asking around about the quiet man. They wanted to know what he had said, what made everyone so thoughtful. One of the men who had been in the room tried to explain it. "It wasn't about what he did or why he's here," he said. "It was about how he talked about life. Like he'd already lived 10 different lives before this one." For days after that, people started watching him a little more closely. The quiet man didn't seem to notice. He went about his usual routine, waking early, folding his blanket, cleaning the kitchen. But something in the air had changed. The same men who used to ignore him now nodded when they saw him. Some even greeted him with a quiet respect. One afternoon, a younger inmate approached him while he was stacking trays. The young man had a restless energy, the kind that comes from too much anger and not enough peace. He said, "Hey, I heard about your letter. You really talk like that?" The quiet man gave a small smile. "I talk when I have something worth saying." The young man laughed a little. "So what's your secret then? How do you stay calm in here? Everyone's losing it and you're just quiet." The man kept working as he replied, "Silence isn't peace, it's practice." The young inmate didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. He came back the next day and the next, always asking questions, always trying to figure the man out. Slowly, a kind of friendship began to form, though it wasn't loud or obvious. They would sit together during meal breaks, saying little, but somehow understanding each other. It wasn't long before more inmates began showing up during those times. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they found a strange comfort in his presence. The quiet man never tried to lead them or teach them, but his way of speaking had a calmness that drew people in. He listened when others talked, and when he spoke, it was never to judge. One evening, a few of them sat around him in the yard. The young one asked, "If you could go back and change one thing, what would it be?" The man looked down at his hands for a moment before saying, "I wouldn't change what happened. I'd change how long it took me to learn from it." That answer stuck with them. The guards noticed too. The same men who once saw him as just another inmate began realizing he had a kind of influence. Not the dangerous kind, but something different. The older guard started stopping by the kitchen more often. He would make small talk while the man worked. Sometimes he'd ask about the book the man always carried, the one without a cover. "What's in that book anyway?" the guard asked one day. "Old lessons," the man said with a faint smile. "From a time when I thought I knew everything." "Did you write it?" "Some of it," he said. "The rest was written by people who knew more than I did." The guard chuckled. "You sound like a teacher." "I used to be," the man replied, wiping down the counter. "In a way." It was the first time he'd given even a hint about his past. Word spread quickly. "He used to be a teacher," someone whispered in the dining hall. Others added their own ideas. "Maybe he was a writer," another said. "He talks like one." But the man himself never confirmed anything more. Weeks went by, and soon the volunteer group announced they were coming back for another writing session. This time, almost half the inmates signed up. The first time, people went for the snacks and a break from the yard. The second time they went because they wanted to hear him speak again. When the volunteers returned, the man sat in the same seat. The new question on the paper was, if you could write a letter to someone you hurt, what would you say? He looked at the question for a long time before writing. His hand moved slower this time, and his eyes seemed heavier. When the time came to share, he hesitated for a moment. But then he stood up again. He read about regret, not the kind that begs for forgiveness, but the kind that grows when someone finally understands the damage their silence caused. He spoke about mistakes that don't disappear even after you pay for them. He said that sometimes punishment isn't a sentence, it's memory. When he finished, there was no applause. There was just quiet, and some people wiping their faces when they thought nobody was looking. One of the volunteers asked if he would let them keep a copy of what he wrote, to include in their program. He agreed. After that day, the man became something of a quiet guide inside the prison. The younger inmates started calling him teacher now, not because he asked them to, but because it just fit. When someone was angry, they went to him. When someone lost hope, they found him sitting under that same tree in the yard, and somehow, after talking with him, things didn't feel so heavy anymore. But not everyone liked it. In prison, influence, no matter how peaceful, can make people suspicious. Some of the other men, the ones who had their own kind of power, started watching him too. They wondered if he was trying to build something. The truth was he wasn't. He just lived in a way that made others want to be better. But jealousy can grow even from good things. One day, while he was in the library returning books, the older guard found him there, standing by the window. The light fell across his face, and for a moment he didn't look like an inmate at all. Just a man who had lived too long with his thoughts. You ever think about what you'll do when you get out? The guard asked quietly. The man smiled softly. If that day comes, I'll try to teach again, but maybe not in a classroom. Maybe here was my classroom all along. The guard didn't know what to say. He just nodded and left him there, still staring out the window. That night, the same young inmate came by his cell. He said, "You know, everyone talks about you now. You're kind of a big deal." The man laughed lightly. Then I failed. Failed? Why? Because the day they stop talking about me and start talking to each other, that's when something real changes. The young man nodded slowly. He didn't fully get it, but he knew it meant something important. Days later, something unexpected happened. The prison warden called the quiet man to his office. Nobody ever got called there unless it was serious. The others watched him walk down the hall, calm as always, while the whispers followed him. What's going on? Is he in trouble? Did they find out something? He entered the warden's office and closed the door. What happened in that room stayed a mystery for a while. All anyone knew was that when he came out, his face looked thoughtful, not worried. He went back to his cell, sat on his bed, and took out the letter he always carried. He unfolded it carefully, read it again, and placed it back inside his notebook. Then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that made everyone wonder what the warden had told him. Wouldn't be long before they found out, because the truth about who the quiet inmate really was finally beginning to come to light. The prison was a noisy place, full of people who had long stopped caring about silence. Every door slammed with a heavy metal sound. Every morning started with yelling, footsteps, and the endless hum of guards doing their rounds. In that chaos, there was one man who never said much. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't even look around too often. People called him the quiet one, though nobody knew his real story. He had arrived almost a year ago. The day he came, the others barely noticed him. He carried a small bag with only a few things inside: a folded shirt, a book without a cover, and a letter that he never let anyone see. He kept to himself from the moment he entered the cell block. When others tried to talk to him, he gave short answers, polite but distant. If someone cracked a joke, he gave a small smile and went back to whatever he was doing. Nobody ever saw him lose his temper, and nobody ever saw him happy either. He was just there. The guards didn't pay him much attention. In their eyes, quiet meant easy. He followed the rules, lined up on time, never started fights, and did his work in the kitchen without complaint. Most days you could find him wiping down the metal counters, washing trays, or sitting in the corner during meal breaks, eating slowly. Some said he was strange. Others said he was harmless. Whatever people thought, he stayed alone. One of the guards, an older man who had been there for decades, often wondered about him. "He's too calm," the guard once said to his partner during lunch. "In this place, calm either means peace or pressure building up." His partner laughed it off, saying some people just don't talk. But the older guard wasn't convinced. He'd seen enough to know that silence in prison could mean anything. Weeks passed and the quiet inmate's routine never changed. He woke up early, even before the lights came on. He would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the small barred window until dawn. When the others were still half asleep, he was already folding his blanket neatly and getting ready for the day. Nobody knew why he did that. It wasn't like neatness got anyone out faster, but it seemed important to him. In the yard, he stayed to one side, far from the groups that claimed corners for themselves. Sometimes he just walked in circles. Other times he would sit under the one tree that managed to survive the harsh air of the place. He would close his eyes, breathe slowly, and stay like that until the guards called everyone back inside. He didn't join any crew, didn't gamble, didn't owe anyone favors. That made him unusual. In a place like that, everyone belonged to someone, except him. The other inmates tried to figure him out. Some thought he was scared. Others thought he was pretending to be quiet until the right moment to prove himself. Rumors grew around him, as they always did in prison. Someone said he used to be a teacher. Someone else swore he had worked for the police. One even claimed he used to be rich but lost everything and turned himself in. The truth was, nobody knew. The only thing that stood out was how everyone respected his space. Maybe it was the way he looked at people, calm but sharp. He didn't look like a man you could push around. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, his words carried a kind of weight. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Even the loudest men in the block didn't bother him. One afternoon, something small happened that made people notice him more. A fight broke out in the yard, just a few steps away from where he was sitting. Two men went at each other hard, swinging and shouting while the guards rushed in. Everyone backed up, cheering or ducking for cover. The quiet inmate didn't move. He just stayed seated, eyes following the scene, calm as ever. When the guards finally broke it up, one of them turned and shouted, "You! Didn't you see what was happening? Why didn't you move?" He looked up and said, "They weren't fighting me, that was all." Then he went back to staring at the sky. From that day, people paid more attention. A few even started calling him Doc, because of how calm and thoughtful he seemed. Others joked that he was a monk doing time. But even with the jokes, there was something about him that made people a little uneasy. Nobody liked a mystery in prison. Secrets could be dangerous. In the evenings, after lights out, some men would whisper across the cells. They'd talk about their cases, their families, or their dreams of getting out. The quiet inmate never joined those talks. Instead, he would sit by the wall writing something in a small notebook. He kept it hidden most of the time, but once a guard caught a glimpse of it during a random check. Inside were pages of careful handwriting, letters maybe, or notes. But what stood out was how neat it all was. Each line was perfectly spaced, written like someone who had spent years practicing patience. "Who you writing to?" the guard asked him that night. He looked up slowly. "To someone who stopped waiting for me a long time ago." The guard didn't ask again. Months went by like that. The prison changed faces. Some inmates left, new ones came in, but the quiet one stayed the same. He never caused trouble, never asked for favors, never complained. But small things about him started to catch attention. He seemed to know things before others did. When there was a surprise inspection, he was already ready for it. When a storm cut the power, he lit a candle he had somehow managed to keep hidden. When someone got sick, he gave them advice that sounded more like something a doctor would say than an inmate. One night, when the power was out, a young man from the next cell started talking to him. "Why don't you ever talk, man? You don't belong here, do you?" For a moment, there was silence. Then came the soft answer, "Maybe not. But sometimes life doesn't ask where you belong. It just puts you somewhere and waits to see what you do." The young man didn't know what to say to that. He just sat there listening to the quiet breathing from the next cell. After that night, more people started noticing how other guards treated him. A few guards seemed to show him a level of quiet respect. They didn't laugh at him or shout like they did with others. They gave him space as if they knew something the rest didn't. When the kitchen needed an extra hand, they trusted him with sharp tools, something not everyone got. That made the others even more curious. Who was this man who could earn respect without saying much? Then came the day everything began to change. A group of volunteers came to the prison, people from outside who ran programs to help inmates prepare for life after release. They set up a table in the library and asked for anyone who wanted to join a writing project. Nobody cared much. Writing didn't mean freedom, but the quiet one signed up. That was the first time anyone had seen him write in public. When he sat down, the room went still. The volunteers gave everyone a question to write about. What would you say if you could send one letter to your younger self? The others joked or scribbled nonsense. But when he started writing, his hand moved quickly, steady and sure. It was as if he had been waiting for that question for years. When time was up, one of the volunteers asked if anyone wanted to read what they wrote. Nobody expected him to raise his hand, but he did.